Good.
So I think, yeah, you can see your presentation. It looks great. And I think people are getting into the room, getting to the meeting. So the next speaker is Nicola Lindgren, and is the only speaker from Malmö, I've been told. So great to have one from the south of Sweden. Very welcome, and please start your presentation.
Thank you. Well, I'm from further south, down from New Zealand, so I don't really sound like my name, if that makes any sense, with a surname like Lindgren. Anywho, I'll get straight into it. Today, I'll be talking about testing without requirements. I'd like to start off by sharing a little story. A few years ago, I joined a team, and I was the first tester in the team. The team already had a business analyst, and they had normal few developers, a product owner, scrum master. And I was asked to test a login feature. Now, we actually had user stories for the login feature where the behavior around what input was allowed in the username and password fields was dictated, the fact that you were allowed a max number of attempts in a certain period of time. And after a bit of testing and back and forth with the developers, we were like, oh, login's working. But then there was no way to log out of the application. I went to the developers and said, when I'm logged in and I've tried looking for this button, I can't seem to log out. And they said, well, there weren't any requirements around logging out, so we didn't build it. And I said, well, login tends to come with logout. Now, this was a perfect example that requirements are everywhere, but they are not always clearly stated. So the business analyst who had written the requirements had obviously assumed that something like login would be coming with a logout functionality. But then the developers had literally interpreted what was written. So fortunately, the logout functionality was added, but took a little bit of extra time. But then here I am talking about requirements, and that there was actually in this project some requirements that existed already in the project. Well, technically, I'm not just going to be talking about testing without requirements, but specifically testing without explicit requirements. So how to read between the lines, but also how to cope when you are asked to test something that is actually very poorly written in terms of documentation, and also how you are going to cope when other people tend to have their own assumptions about how software is supposed to behave. So I'd like to show an example here of a more real-world situation of requirements, but this is actually a job ad I found a few months ago. Now, just for the record, I was only looking for it for the sake of this presentation, just, and here there's a list of fairly standard requirements on a QA that they're looking for. They want someone with at least 3 years of professional experience, mobile and UI automation, API automation, performance testing, manual testing, understanding of CI/CD, QA lead experience. But as a QA who's been working for like 8-9 years, I found that often people have other expectations in QA that aren't actually explicitly stated in this job ad. For example, people tend to expect that you can write a clear, reproducible bug with actual result and expected result and screenshots and stuff. It seems that the person who wrote this ad just expected that they'd be able to do that. So they didn't think to include this in this job ad. Another thing I've come across in general is that people say you should, as a QA, you should be able to build a good relationship with the developers and other people in your team so you can do your job effectively. Again, this is not mentioned. You could say that this is kind of implied in the strong experience in manual testing and so on bullet point, but we are not clearly told that this is what they want from someone. Here's another example, a little bit more fun. This is a burger menu of a place I like to go to called Tugg. They actually have chains all over Sweden, so maybe you've gone to a local branch as well. And this is like, it's gonna say a normal burger place. It's not like a vegan place, or it's not known in a more special way. Starting from the top, the burger has mixed fries, truffle mayonnaise, coleslaw, and coffee, and that bubble sparkling water or still water is included. Scrolling down, this is my favorite order, a chili sensation. It comes with chili dressing, lettuce, cheddar cheese, maple syrup bacon, roasted jalapeno. And at the bottom right, we're told that it's well done, the meat. But we're never here told explicitly which meat we're dealing with. So here, as a customer with my own experiences and expectations, I'm expecting beef mince patty. And that is actually what you have here. So often in the real world, not everything is going to be spelled out clearly as to what people are wanting or expecting. So implicit requirements versus explicit requirements. Explicit requirements are spoken or written requirements. That is, they are explicitly stated. Whereas implicit requirements are unspoken or unwritten requirements. So you need to infer them. And this is a much trickier area I have found to deal with. In general, I have found there are three things that shapes people's implicit requirements. So the first thing is people's past experiences. So that is the various projects they have worked on in the past. Just their real life experience when they themselves, so for example, the people who are writing the user stories or the client who's ordering a feature, what they have seen in the past. But the second also would be people's understanding of what the company does or is. So for example, on the Tugg burger menu I spoke about, I told you that I saw this as like a normal burger place, like it wasn't, say, a vegan place. So I was expecting a beef mince patty. You could say in a more software example, maybe something like IKEA, which is known to be family friendly, then maybe their website should be built in a way that's easy to navigate through, because if you're assuming it's family friendly and people are busy, then they don't want to spend a lot of time navigating through the website. But the biggest one I have found that shapes implicit requirements is what people assume to be a given. In my opening story about login, I talked about how the business analyst had assumed as well that log out would come out with login. So what's the point in being so clear in dictating all the behavior of log out and that there should be a button there in the first place, when you would think the log out button should come with a login. So then the question is, what should I do if, or to be honest, when you're faced with unclear requirements or a lack of requirements? The first thing I tend to do is to state my assumptions clearly. So when I need to test something that that basically there's no requirements at all and they're just ordering something so vague, or it's poorly written that there's just, it's too open to interpretation, then I make an effort to say, well, this is what I think should happen. I will both write this down and say, okay, so I'll give you an example. If you were to do the login functionality and you just wanted this functionality and you told me to test this, but you didn't give me any more details, I would then say, all right, well then username without anything else, maybe that's going to be your email address. So then I'd expect that you'd be looking for the @ plus the dot or the full stop. With password, I would say I'd expect this to be appearing as asterisks as I type in the password, and there's some sort of minimum character limit. The good thing about stating your assumptions clearly is that if you are wrong, then you can be told that. So it's better to find out that you're wrong sooner rather than later. But the second thing also is that it's a starting point. So by clearly sharing my assumptions, or as a tester, my expectations, then people will then be able to correct you. Sometimes when you ask a client or someone what they want, and it's such an open question, they don't really know, right? It's a little bit too open. But if you start to say, okay, well then I'm thinking if this is the little stuff you're actually going to give me, you can say, well then this, and then they will start to say, oh, actually no, they'll make corrections. Instead of a 8-character minimum password with no limitations on characters, we expect 10 characters with at least a capital letter and so on. So it gives them a nice starting point. The reason I like to both write this down and to tell it to people is to give less room for misunderstanding. Sometimes things can get missed in translation, but also I find that it gives people a chance to think. So especially with written, I would write things in advance and then have a discussion with the team where I would show my testing notes and my expectations on things. And then sometimes people need a little bit of time to think and process, and then they'll come back to me later with some feedback on what should actually happen. Another effective way I've found to help me test without requirements is to use heuristics. But to better understand heuristics, I think it's important to first look at oracles. So what's an oracle? It's a heuristic that is a mental shortcut that allows people to solve problems and make judgments quickly and efficiently. So then what's a heuristic? It's what you use to determine if a test has passed or failed. In many projects, this is the written requirements. So I've found many testers need some sort of, not just need written requirements, they need actually very clear, detailed written requirements, because they write their test cases on the basis of making sure that every requirement is fulfilled. And I have worked with many testers who find themselves unable to even start thinking about how they test the feature unless this is detailed. The thing is, there are other tools at our disposal. An acronym I like to use when testing, not just in a context without requirements, but also with, because it helps fill in the gaps, is something called hiccups. So I'll go through each letter in turn with an example. So consistency with history. So here's an example of a New Zealand book website. So let's say that we were to revamp this website. A few things I'd like to highlight here is the top categories. So top picks, book, stationery, arts, craft, games and puzzles. And then the book section on the right-hand side. So they have fiction, children's books, young adult. If I were to test against this heuristic, consistency with history means that you're making sure that any new version of something is consistent with previous ones. So maybe I'd be making sure that these would be in the same order, the categories, as well as the ones in the books. But another way you could interpret, or I interpret personally, consistency with history is making sure that past actions you've done during your testing is consistent with what you see later on. Another example, which I'll talk about and doesn't refer to the slide, is let's say you're doing some online shopping, right? And you add to cart a Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone book, and it costs 200 kernel. So then later on, as you go to your checkout page and to your basket and you fill in your details, I'd expect to see that book referred to costing 200 kronos throughout. I would say it as a failure or that there's something wrong if the price changes or another book is mysteriously added to cart or the book disappears. So it's making sure that what I've done in the past is consistent with what I'm seeing now. Consistency with image. An example here would be a luxury fashion website that's not very colorful. So I was looking up some luxury, or I guess what they call luxury. I mean, I'm not really into luxury myself, like Prada and Michael Kors, and they all tend to be like quite dark, like black, quite simple. They don't have a lot of color. So it's making sure that what you believe the company wants to portray is consistent with the image they are actually portraying. A consistency with comparable products. So this would be making sure that, say you're testing something that is, like this is a messaging app, that it's consistent with other messaging apps that you have seen before. So before I used WhatsApp and now I use Signal. I didn't really have to try and figure out how to use Signal because it was very intuitive. So with a messaging app, on the right-hand side is the home messages screen. You'll generally see like the create message icon. And then if I had any friends back now, if I had people I had already started messaging, then there'd be a row of messages here, or at least people's names along with the first two lines they've written me recently. And this is fairly consistent with other messaging apps you probably have in your phone. On the left-hand side is the camera functionality. So here you have the normal large tap button to actually take a photo, being able to, instead of taking a photo, sending one you already have on your phone, switching the camera so it's not a selfie, but outwards facing. These are certain things that when you're testing something, you're using, instead of say instead of referring to some sort of written requirement, you're referring to what you've already seen in the world that is similar, to use that as a point of reference as to whether or not the behavior you're seeing is correct or not. Consistency with claims. So when you're testing against this heuristic, you are making sure that whatever the company has claimed about the feature or the app is true. So an example here, if you go on the Dreams app website, is that the Dreams app makes saving as easy as spending. A bit of background for people who haven't come across it yet. The Dreams app is an app that helps you save. So you can have automatic things set up that will automatically take money out of your account and transfer it to your savings account. You could also, like with like 1 or 2 buttons, when you choose to skip eating out for lunch, then it will transfer what it sees as the equivalent of a normal lunch into your savings account. So it's supposed to be very user-friendly. Consistency with user desires or expectations. This heuristic used to be known as consistency with user expectations, but now it's called consistency with user desires. Under this heuristic, you are testing to make sure that a reasonable user can do what they want to do. an example would be for internet banking, you wanted to apply for a home loan. Now you could say that since you're already logged in and the bank already has quite a bit of information about you, then when you're instead of having to fill in again your name and your last name, and I don't know if they'd even, your salary, then a lot of information could then be pre-filled. So you may have these expectations that a reasonable user would desire that in the application or in the functionality. Consistency within the product itself. So this is making sure that what you are testing is consistent with other parts of the website. The example, so one example that I often look for is, say, like colors. So for example, that a confirm button or like the positive buttons are the same color, but also the order of drop-down lists. So when you have to select a country, a one page, you may have your default country being Sweden, and then you may have the other Scandinavian countries and then alphabetical order. So if I ever saw a list of like a drop-down list for countries elsewhere in the website, I'd expect it to be listed in the same order. This is a more visual example. So what I would like to highlight to you here is the breadcrumbs. So one thing I found interesting was that on the left-hand side, the breadcrumbs is at the top. On this side, it's further down below the image. Another thing I found interesting here was that they call it desserts on the right-hand page and dessert recipes on the left. I mean, I'm pretty sure they're referring to the same thing. So whether, I don't know for sure if I'd raise a bug against it, but I would definitely be asking questions to make sure that this was intentional. Consistency with purpose. If you are testing against this heuristic, you are making sure that you're able to do what you are supposed to be able to do, that you're fulfilling that it fulfills the goal or purpose of the app or functionality. So for example, a messaging app means that you should be able to actually send and receive messages. And that's kind of like a given. So if if messages aren't going through and they're getting stuck, then that would be failing this heuristic. Or if, that's the main part here. Consistency with statutes, or here you are testing against the law. So in the EU, you have GDPR that was introduced like 2 to 3 years ago, I think. So making sure that any new features that you build are compliant with that. The second one that I had come across recently at work was around accessibility. So there are these guidelines around accessibility that if you're going to have a website in the US, there's rules around contrast and size, and that someone could that you have the option to have the website read out aloud to you. So making sure that any local laws are that you're being compliant with them. Now, there's another test strategy model that I would like to briefly touch on. And so the heuristic test strategy model is a set of patterns for designing and choosing tests to perform. I find this is a good way to help test on a project, again, like with hiccups, not just when you don't have any requirements, but even when they exist, and it gives you a better understanding. I tend to focus on this aspect. I tend to focus on product elements personally. I just found that to be the most useful for me. So product elements, again, there's another acronym, but I tend to focus on function and data. So, so function is everything the product does. So you would be focusing on the functionality that you're able to do things. Whereas with data, you would be focusing on everything that the product processes. So how you're able to manipulate data and making sure, like, say for CRUD, create, read, update, delete, that can be done correctly. I'm only briefly touching this. I don't want to spend as much time on the heuristic test strategy model, but I recommend it as later reading. So in summary, I think it's important to understand that even if there are no requirements, there are actually still requirements, that is, implicit requirements. The second is the goal is a shared understanding. I think it's important to state your assumptions, especially so then if people are, if you as a tester have misunderstood things or you're wrong, then people can correct you. But it's a great way to have a conversation. So saying or writing enough so that you have a starting point, and then people can kind of work from there. Third, to use heuristics to help you fill the gaps. I really briefly touch on the heuristic test strategy model, but I think hiccups is a really good thing to use. And then, yeah, remember heuristic test strategy model and hiccups. These are some readings I recommend. So if you Google them, you should be able to find them. Testing without a map goes into more detail about the heuristics, the consistency heuristics I talked about in my presentation. On that note, thank you. And does anyone have any questions?
Thank you very much. Shout out your questions or write it in the chat or whatever you like. I think it was a very interesting presentation. A lot of things to think about and a lot of new things that I have learned.
Thank you.
So any questions? Nicola, do you see the chat?
Yes. Yeah. So the question is, what happens when the assumptions you made are not aligned with the product owner? How important is communication here? I find, I mean, I don't think it's a bad thing when you're not aligned, because at least you know, as opposed to later down the track. If what I'm expecting doesn't align with the product owner, since they have more direct access to customers, I'm not going to say they probably win, but I tend to give the benefit of the doubt. So if I feel like I have clearly communicated my point and my concern, saying, well, in other apps, this is what tends to happen, or like if I can present a well-justified case, but then despite that, based on what the customers say they want, we still disagree, then I would say it's up to the product owner. I see my role as QA or as a test as a provider of information. So I'm not going to be so insistent on being like, oh, I'm right. But at least making sure that if I'm very confident that I've argued my case and they understand it, so that's, you know, communication is both ways, right? It's not just saying what you think and what you found, but making sure that they have heard the same message, then it's up to them, really. I found generally the product owner is ultimately the boss. Are implicit requirements sometimes even preferred over written requirements? I just need to have to think about that one. I have never been in a situation where it is. We do try to make as much things implicit later on explicit, so they start off being implicit. And then later on, you can find that what would happen is we would then have a discussion about some of my expectations. And then they say, oh yeah, they might not agree with what I've said, but then they'll edit something I've said to make a new requirement, and then that can contradict something else they've said they already want. And then it's about highlighting that now there's a difference and that they need to choose. Well, you can't have both. You can't have, buttons, the checkout button in both of these places or something. So I think it's, I think it depends, but generally the good thing about having implicit requirement is if you do later make it explicit, then you're able to get a better idea what you actually want. 1 second. I find it easier to advocate for fighting that is implicit. What is your trick to speak up for it? Yeah, I found it hard too, because like with explicit requirements on a project, then you have like something clear to point to. And I found the challenging part for me before is when I've worked with testers who refuse to believe that you can have requirements that are not explicit, that the only ones that actually exist are explicit ones. So the good thing is by using heuristics, like the ones I referred to, but I'm sure there are more, you have like a language to communicate with. So like if I said to you, like say I was testing messaging gap, WhatsApp does this as well, right? It doesn't sound so professional, but then if you have like better language to say, well, comparable products, things that the customers would have used before, they'll have these expectations of messaging app, so we should use this as well. Then you are better able to argue your case. I also try to, I'm still answering Jens' question about speaking up for implicit requirements. I do also try to get down to the bottom of someone's concern. So if they are so insistent on explicit requirements, I then ask a question as to like, okay, well then, do you think that if we literally tested word for word against these requirements, that it'd be behaving as perfect? They may say yes, but then, there's usually things you can catch them out on, right? So like performance, those aren't always documented, but if something was like shitty slow, like if it was like 30 seconds to load, then you'd say there's a problem. Or security. So something like the password example I gave with asterisks. I've worked on multiple login applications, but I've never seen something written saying, oh, there should be asterisks there. So there's often some sort of example you can give to prove that based on the experience that they have seen, that you can't explicitly state everything. What is your view on the importance or not of the tester's knowledge of the test object or product? I just need to think for a second. I think it helps to have some knowledge in the test object or product. I hope I'm interpreting the question correctly. Could you expand on that question a bit? Sorry, Karin. What's your view on the importance of tester's knowledge of test object or product? Sorry. Okay. Karin, could you rephrase it slightly? I'm struggling a bit to understand it, sorry. I'll come back to it. Just let me think. What is your view on the importance?
Karin, you can just speak up if you like to explain.
Yeah.
Make it more understandable. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I found.
Okay. Sorry about that. Are you all right with the question? I'm sorry if that was a bit.
I think your you expanding at 1124 definitely helps. I found that for me, it's a hell of a lot easier to test things that I've got previous knowledge of, whether or not that is based on previous projects I've been on. So my background is actually fairly strong with e-commerce, but also just past experience. So if I've used similar apps before, it's a lot easier because I found that if there's a lack of requirements and I'm testing something that's completely new, then I do struggle a bit more as to know what to expect. So then I do try to I try to ask more questions about, is there anything we're missing? Or I go back to the heuristics and see if there's any I can fill out. So maybe comparable products I wouldn't be able to do, but maybe history I could do. So I'm not sure about importance, but I think often for a tester, in such a way, it can be easier to test something that you yourself have already product knowledge of. Does anyone have any other questions?
Sorry. Okay, thanks very much. It was really interesting and a lot of questions. I think it's sounds like a great interest for what you have to say. So thank you very much. And I assume people can write to you if they like to know more about the topic or something like that.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Sweet.
Okej, det var sista presentationen innan lunch. Vi är tillbaks 12:45 för en efter lunch introduktion. Och då använder ni samma Zoom-länk som ni gjorde i morse på introduktionen. Och så börjar presentationen på det här spåret igen klockan 13:00. Och det finns även mingel under lunchen ifall man inte vill sitta och äta helt själv utan vill prata och chatta med någon under lunchen, så finns det en Zoom-länk på den också. Om ni inte har en Zoom-länk som syns på schema så får ni helt enkelt ladda om sidan. Gör en refresh så kommer ni få upp Zoom-länkar på det också. Det hade inte jag gjort nämligen, men jag fick hjälp med det. Så nu inser jag att det är så man gör också. Så där har ni Zoom-länkar både till lunchminglet och till efter lunchintroduktionen. Och klockan 1 så kör vi på samma länk som ni har varit på hittills. Tack så mycket för nu, så syns vi strax.